In this video, I will explain whether Huggy Wuggy is still alive after the prototype attacked him at the end of Poppy Playtime Chapter 5, because the scene looks fatal when you first watch it. But one small detail makes Huggy's death much harder to confirm than it seems. Experiment 1006 drives one of his claws directly through Huggy's chest, throws him onto the ground, and immediately takes control of the situation. That should have been the end of Experiment 1170. Instead, Huggy moves after the attack. We see him react while the prototype is still standing over him, and then the game forces us to run before showing what happens next. Considering that this is the same creature who survived the enormous fall at the end of Chapter 1, I do not think Mob Entertainment left that final movement in the scene by accident. There is a serious possibility that Huggy survived once again, but his condition after the attack may be completely different from what most people expect. Watch the video until the end because every detail is important and only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy Poppy Playtime theories like this, consider subscribing. It is free and it is the best way to support more videos like this. Now, before we go deeper, I do not want to give you the easiest possible theory and say Huggy is alive, only because we saw his head move after he was stabbed. That detail is important, but by itself it is not enough. A character can still move for a short time after receiving a fatal injury, especially in a horror game where the scene is designed to create tension. If we want to answer this correctly, we need to look at Huggy's entire history. What Experiment 1170 has already survived? Why the prototype was hunting him before the final scene? How his body reacts to the actual attack? And most importantly, what the game deliberately refuses to show us afterward. To understand why this matters, we need to return to Chapter 1. The Huggy Wuggy we meet at the beginning of Poppy Playtime is Experiment 1170, one of Playtime Co.'s most successful bigger bodies creations. He was not originally designed to roam through the factory as a random predator. His obedient qualities made him useful as a security presence, which is one reason the official Chapter 5 description can still refer to Huggy as Playtime's security system years later. When we first enter the factory, Huggy stands motionless in the central lobby, then he disappears. For a large part of Chapter 1, his presence is built through distance. We catch glimpses of him watching from openings and corridors until the game finally reveals what he has been doing. Huggy begins hunting us. The chase eventually sends the player into the ventilation system, where Experiment 1170 moves through spaces that should barely be able to contain his body. We escape the vents, reach the catwalk, and use a heavy box to knock him from the platform. Huggy falls. He hits structures on the way down before disappearing into a huge opening below the factory. For years, that scene was treated as Huggy's death by a lot of players. It certainly looked like one. But there was always a problem. We never saw the body. That becomes important when we compare Huggy with what happens to the next major antagonist. Mommy Longlegs dies in Chapter 2, and the game does not leave her situation nearly as open. Her body is pulled through the grinder. We watch the machine destroy her, and immediately afterward the prototype reaches into the room and takes what remains. The visual language is completely different. With Mommy, the game shows the destruction, and then shows what happens to the corpse. With Huggy, the game only shows the fall. That difference created years of theories, but Chapter 5 finally gives us the answer. Huggy survived. The monster chasing us in Broken Things is not simply another blue mascot being used to imitate him. Chapter 5 builds entire sequences around the return of Experiment 1170 and even lets us experience pieces of his own memory through the reanimation section. That means something very important for the current theory. We already have proof that the first time Poppy Playtime made Huggy look dead, he was not actually dead. This does not automatically mean he survived the prototype. The injuries are completely different, but it means we need to take Huggy's durability seriously. Experiment 1170 is extremely difficult to kill, and Chapter 1 is not the only evidence. Earlier lore connected to Huggy's escape from Playtime Co. in 1992 shows how resilient he was even before the events of the main game. During the incident, security personnel pursued Experiment 1170 after he escaped containment. Huggy was hit and continued moving through the surrounding area before eventually being recaptured. The importance of this event is not the exact weapon used against him. It is the broader pattern. Huggy's body can continue functioning after damage that would stop an ordinary living creature. By the time we meet him in Chapter 1, he is already the result of Playtime Co.'s experiments with creating oversized living toys. His biology does not follow normal human limits. Then the player sends him falling deep into the factory. He survives that too. When Huggy returns, however, he does not look untouched. That part matters. Survival does not mean invulnerability. The condition of his body shows that Chapter 1 had consequences. Experiment 1170 survived, but he carried damage forward rather than magically resetting to the perfect mascot we originally saw. This gives us a useful rule for interpreting Chapter 5. Huggy can survive extreme trauma, but injuries still matter. So the real question after the prototype's attack is not whether the stab hurt him badly. It obviously did. The question is whether that single strike caused enough damage to finish a creature that has already survived so much. Now let's move into Chapter 5, because something happens long before the final scene that completely changes Huggy's relationship with Experiment 1006. At the beginning of Broken Things, Huggy is one of our main threats. The official description does not hide this. We are told that we are entering the gruesome depths of Playtime Co., with Huggy Wuggy in hot pursuit, and the game delivers exactly that. Huggy breaks into the area where we begin. The chase resumes. Later, he manages to take the player's grab pack equipment and repeatedly appears in locations where we are trying to progress deeper into the factory. If you only looked at those scenes, it would be easy to make one assumption. Huggy works for the prototype. We are inside Experiment 1006's domain, and Huggy is trying to kill the person who wants to stop him. That seems to fit. Then Chapter 5 destroys that explanation. While the player is hiding inside Chum Chompkins, the prototype arrives. We hear Experiment 1006 giving instructions. He assigns Chum tasks involving security and Poppy. But during that conversation, the prototype mentions something else. His hunters are going after 1170. Experiment 1170 is Huggy Wuggy. That one line changes Huggy's entire position in the chapter. The prototype is not sending Huggy after us. He is hunting Huggy. This means the two monsters are already in conflict before the ending happens. Huggy can still be dangerous to the player without being loyal to Experiment 1006? That distinction explains something that would otherwise be confusing. If Huggy belonged completely to the prototype, there would be little reason for Experiment 1006 to send his own hunters after him. Instead, Huggy appears to be moving through the prototype's territory independently. He attacks us because of his own motivations, conditioning, or memory of what happened in Chapter 1. At the same time, something inside the lower factory is trying to find him. Now the final scene is no longer a random villain attacking another monster. The attack is the conclusion of a hunt that was already happening throughout Chapter 5. The prototype wanted 1170 found. Eventually, he finds him himself. That gives us much more reason to pay attention to what happens next. Before we get there, however, Chapter 5 gives us something we never had before. Huggy's perspective. Inside the reanimation area, we experience memories connected to Experiment 1170 and the conditioning process used by Playtime Co. These sequences reveal how Huggy was trained through controlled environments and punishment. The company tried to shape a living creature into something useful, obedient, and predictable. This is important for two reasons. First, it explains why Huggy's aggression may not represent one simple choice. The monster was created inside a system designed to condition his behavior. Second, it finally gives the player access to the person or consciousness behind the mascot. For most of the series, Huggy has been defined entirely from the outside. We see teeth, we hear screaming, we run. Chapter 5 slows down long enough to show that Experiment 1170 has memories. That is a major storytelling change, and I think it matters to his survival because the game usually does not spend this much time expanding a character's internal history immediately before removing that character forever, without resolution. The reanimation section makes Huggy more important at the exact moment the larger story begins changing his role. That is not proof he survives. But from a narrative perspective, it would be strange to reveal his conditioning, confirm his independence from the prototype, reconnect him with Kissy, and then permanently kill him a few minutes later without allowing any of those developments to continue. This becomes stronger when we reach the final Huggy chase. Experiment 1170 finds the player again. At this point, nothing suggests he has forgiven what happened in Chapter 1. He attacks. We run. The chase carries us toward the tramway, where it looks like the game is preparing another confrontation between Huggy and the player. Then Kissy Missy appears. This is the moment where Huggy does something we rarely see him do. He stops. Kissy approaches him carefully. Huggy is still aggressive and uncertain at first, but he does not immediately attack her. She gets close enough to inspect his injuries. Then she reaches toward him. Huggy hesitates. Eventually, he begins reaching back. For the first time in years, Huggy and Kissy are reconnecting. This scene gives us an extremely important piece of information about Experiment 1170. The creature inside Huggy can still recognize Kissy. Whatever happened to him during the experiments, the fall and the years spent inside the lower factory did not completely erase that relationship. The official character material has always presented Kissy as Huggy's counterpart, but Chapter 5 turns that simple mascot connection into an emotional part of the bigger body story. And this is exactly when the prototype attacks. Experiment 1006 does not arrive after Huggy has attacked Kissy. He interrupts the reconciliation. One of his claws comes down and impales Huggy directly through the torso. The attack is violent. Huggy is lifted and thrown onto the floor. Kissy immediately reacts and attacks the prototype, but she is overpowered as well. This is the scene most people point to when they say Huggy died, and I understand why. A massive claw goes straight through his body. Experiment 1006 is strong enough to kill Catnap and has spent multiple chapters proving how dangerous he is. If any character in the factory can kill Huggy, the prototype is one of the best candidates. But this is where we need to stop looking only at the attack and start looking at what happens afterward. Huggy moves. After being impaled and thrown aside, Experiment 1170 is not shown completely motionless. He raises his head toward the prototype. The movement is visible enough that contemporary ending coverage specifically pointed it out when discussing whether Huggy survived. That is the first major problem with declaring him dead. If the developers wanted that claw to be an immediately fatal strike, there was no reason to animate Huggy responding after it. They could have left his body completely still. They did not. Now, movement alone is not confirmation of survival. A mortally wounded character can still move. That is why the next part of the scene matters even more. The prototype prepares to continue, but we do not see the next strike land on Huggy. The player is forced to leave. Our attention shifts to escaping Experiment 1006. The game intentionally takes the camera away from Huggy before the situation is resolved. That creates almost exactly the same type of uncertainty Poppy Playtime has used before. We see something that looks fatal. We do not see a clean final confirmation. The character disappears from our immediate perspective. That is exactly what happened with Huggy in Chapter 1. The events are not identical, but the storytelling method is remarkably similar. And now we know what happened the first time. Huggy survived. This is where the evidence ends and the theory begins. There is another detail that makes the lack of confirmation even more suspicious. Huggy Wuggy is not a minor Chapter 5 monster. He is the original face of Poppy Playtime. Mob Entertainment specifically used his return as part of the official description for Broken Things. The entire opening of the chapter is built around the fact that Experiment 1170 is back. We are given new Huggy memories. The prototype's hunters are looking for him. Kissy finally reunites with him. Those events create several unresolved story threads. Killing Huggy permanently without showing the actual death would leave all of them hanging. That is possible. Horror stories sometimes do exactly that. But Poppy Playtime has repeatedly used missing confirmation as a reason to bring important characters back later. The safest conclusion is therefore not that Huggy definitely survived. It is that Chapter 5 deliberately refuses to confirm that he died. And that difference is important. Now let's compare the scene with Catnap, because Catnap gives us a much clearer example of how the game handles a major character when it wants us to understand that the prototype has killed them. At the end of Chapter 3, Catnap is critically wounded. Experiment 1006 appears. Catnap initially reacts with devotion. Then the prototype kills him. The scene is presented as the final result of Catnap's relationship with his god. There is no immediate chase forcing us away before we understand what happened. The emotional purpose of the scene depends on Catnap realizing that his savior is actually his executioner. Mommy Longlegs is similarly direct. She is destroyed. The prototype takes her. With Huggy, we do not get that level of closure. He is attacked. He reacts. Then the story pulls us away. That feels much closer to an unresolved fate than a completed death scene. The difference becomes even more interesting because Experiment 1006 had already been trying to find Huggy earlier. If the prototype finally caught the experiment he had been hunting and permanently killed him, showing that outcome clearly would complete a chapter-long subplot. Instead, the subplot remains open. Why? One possibility is that the prototype simply believed the first stab had done enough damage and turned his attention elsewhere. Another is that Kissy's intervention prevented him from immediately finishing Huggy. A third possibility is that Huggy escaped or was moved after the player left. And there is also a darker explanation. The prototype may have taken him. We need to consider this because Experiment 1006 has a long history of collecting bodies and body parts from important experiments. After Mommy Longlegs dies, he takes her remains. Catnap's final encounter also ends with the prototype directly claiming him. Chapter 5 shows Experiment 1006 grotesque body using physical material associated with previous monsters. So even if Huggy was too injured to move after the tramway fight, death would not necessarily remove him from the future story. The prototype could have wanted 1170 for a reason that goes beyond killing him. This may actually explain why his hunters were pursuing Huggy. Maybe Experiment 1006 wanted Huggy captured, not merely dead. Huggy is one of Playtime Co.'s strongest bigger bodies experiments. He has extraordinary durability. His size makes him physically useful. If the prototype is building, modifying, or experimenting with bodies in the wrong side, Experiment 1170 would be incredibly valuable material. That means the outcome could be worse than death. Huggy might survive the stab only to be captured and altered. This creates several possibilities for Chapter 6, and not all of them involve Huggy returning normally. But before we get into those theories, there's another clue we need to examine. Kissy, Missy. The entire final scene is built around their reunion. Kissy does not simply arrive and attack Huggy to save us. She reaches him. The chase stops. We see that connection returning. Then Experiment 1006 destroys the moment. From a storytelling perspective, that timing is extremely deliberate. If Huggy dies permanently seconds later, the reunion becomes a tragic final goodbye. That is certainly possible. But if Huggy survives, the reunion becomes the beginning of a new motivation. And I think the second option gives Chapter 6 much more to work with. Remember what happened immediately before the attack. Huggy was willing to lower his aggression around Kissy. That means Kissy can influence him in a way the player cannot. If both survive, Chapter 6 now has a natural way to use Huggy differently without making him suddenly friendly. Kissy can remain the connection between us. That is important because Huggy's future does not need to be another chase. We have already done that. Chapter 1 was built around Huggy hunting us. Chapter 5 brings the chase back on a much larger scale. Doing the same thing again in Chapter 6 would risk making his role repetitive. Survival only becomes interesting if his position changes. The prototype has already given him a reason for that change. Experiment 1006 was hunting him, then he personally impaled him. He also attacked Kissy during the same confrontation. If Huggy wakes up after that, his biggest enemy may no longer be the player. That does not mean he forgives us. It means the situation has changed. And this is one reason I think Huggy's survival is more useful to the story than his death. He can now become a third force inside the final conflict. The player wants Poppy back and needs to stop Experiment 1006. The prototype wants control over the lower factory and has taken Poppy. Huggy may simply want revenge in Kissy. Those motivations can overlap without turning him into a hero. That makes his possible return much more interesting than bringing him back only for another jump scare. Now let's address the strongest argument for Huggy actually being dead. The prototype's attack is extremely severe. This is not the same as Huggy being shot with a tranquilizer years earlier. It is not even the same as falling from the Chapter 1 catwalk. Experiment 1006 drives a massive claw through his torso. The location of the wound could have destroyed important organs or whatever biological systems keep Experiment 1170 alive. Huggy's movement afterward might simply be the last reaction of a dying creature. There is no guarantee that lifting his head means he can recover. That is completely fair. And if we only had the physical evidence, I would say his chances were uncertain. But Poppy Playtime does not operate through normal anatomy. That is the problem. These experiments survive things that should not be survivable. Chapter 5 itself gives us the clearest example with the player. Experiment 1006 stabs us through the chest later in the same ending. The attack is presented as fatal. We collapse. The prototype throws us into Poppy gel. Then Giblet shocks us back to life. That sequence establishes, within minutes of Huggy's injury, that catastrophic piercing trauma does not necessarily equal permanent death inside this part of the factory. I'm not saying Huggy was dropped into Poppy gel too. We do not see that. But the existence of restoration technology changes the limits of what can happen after we leave. The tramway area already contains Poppy gel nearby during the Huggy chase. The lower facility is full of reanimation research. Giblet knows enough to revive the player. So even if Huggy's wound was eventually fatal without help, Chapter 6 has believable ways to keep him alive. This is where the theory becomes much more interesting. Maybe Huggy survives naturally because Experiment 1170 is extraordinarily durable. Maybe Kissy saves him after the prototype leaves. Maybe Giblet or another surviving character eventually reaches him. The game does not need to invent a miracle. Chapter 5 has already built multiple systems around regeneration and reanimation. That means Huggy's fate depends less on whether the claw was dangerous and more on what happened during the period we were not watching, and the game deliberately hides that period. Now, let's look at what happens after the player wakes up. Giblet tells us the prototype took Poppy. When he tries to explain what happened to Kissy, he does not know. That uncertainty is important. The chapter does not give us a clean report saying the Wuggies are dead. Nobody confirms their bodies. Nobody tells the player there was nothing left to save. The story simply continues while their status remains unresolved. Some ending analysis has also noted that their bodies are no longer clearly accounted for by the time the player recovers. That creates another possibility. Someone moved them. The prototype is the obvious candidate. If Experiment 1006 took Huggy and Kissy after attacking them, Chapter 6 could reveal that the tramway scene was not an execution. It was a capture. This would explain why the prototype was already sending hunters after 1170. He wanted Huggy back under control, and once Huggy became vulnerable, Experiment 1006 finally had the opportunity. If that is what happened, Huggy could return in a condition very different from Chapter 5. The prototype may attempt to repair him. He may try to recondition him. He may attach new parts, or he may use Experiment 1170 as material for something larger. This is one of the darker possibilities because it would make Huggy's survival technically good news while creating a much worse problem. A living Huggy under the prototype's control would be more dangerous than the independent Huggy we have been dealing with. Remember what Chapter 5's memory sequence tells us. Huggy has been conditioned before. The company developed methods for shaping his behavior. If Experiment 1006 has access to Playtime Co.'s deepest research, he may be capable of repeating or modifying that process. Imagine Chapter 6 bringing Huggy back after we assume he survived. At first, we are relieved. Then something is wrong. Kissy approaches him again. This time, Huggy does not respond the same way. The prototype has damaged or suppressed whatever memory allowed Experiment 1170 to recognize her. That would turn the Chapter 5 reunion into something even more important because it would show us exactly what was lost. The player might then have to restore Huggy's memories instead of simply defeating him. That would connect the reanimation sequences directly to the present story. It would also give Huggy a full arc instead of another repeated monster encounter. Now there is another possibility that may be even more straightforward. Huggy escaped after the prototype moved on. Remember, Experiment 1170 is extremely good at surviving and disappearing. Chapter 1 already proves that. He falls into the depths and vanishes for years. During the 1992 escape incident, security struggled to contain him over a large area. Chapter 5 shows that even the prototype has to send hunters specifically to pursue 1170. That tells us Huggy knows how to evade capture. If the stab did not immediately incapacitate him completely, Huggy may have crawled away after the player and prototype left the tramway. His body was badly injured, but that has never stopped him from disappearing before. This theory has one major advantage. It explains why Chapter 6 could bring Huggy back without requiring anyone to rescue him. Experiment 1170 has survived on his own before. He can do it again, but if he does, I do not think we would see the same Huggy from the beginning of Chapter 5. The prototype's attack should leave another visible injury. Chapter 1 already changed his body. Chapter 5 could change it again. A Chapter 6 Huggy might move more slowly. He could have difficulty using part of his body. The stab may leave a huge wound through his torso. That damage would make his return feel believable rather than treating the attack as meaningless, and it could change the way Huggy hunts or fights. Maybe Experiment 1170 can no longer chase the player through long areas at full speed. Instead, he uses ambushes, or perhaps the injury forces him to rely more heavily on Kissy. That would naturally bring their relationship into gameplay. The point is that survival should have a cost. Poppy Playtime has already shown that with Huggy once, there is no reason not to do it again. Now let's talk about one small visual detail that I think deserves more attention. After Experiment 1006 impales Huggy, the game gives us enough time to see him lift his head. That means Huggy is conscious enough to identify the thing standing over him. If he survives, this matters enormously. Experiment 1170 now knows exactly who attacked him. Before this scene, we could debate whether Huggy understood why the prototype's hunters were pursuing him. After the attack, there is no ambiguity. Experiment 1006 personally hurt him. Then he hurt Kissy. This creates memory and motivation at the same moment. If Chapter 6 begins with Huggy recovering, the game does not need dialogue to explain what he wants. The last major thing he remembers is the prototype attacking the reunion. That is enough. This also provides a reason for mob entertainment to leave Huggy alive beyond simple popularity. He now has unfinished business. A permanently dead Huggy cannot react to what Experiment 1006 did. A surviving Huggy can. That creates consequences for the prototype. And consequences are important because Chapter 5 spends much of its story showing Experiment 1006, destroying relationships and manipulating broken creatures. Huggy surviving would mean one of those creatures can finally respond. Now let's compare his situation with Kissy's. Kissy is also impaled during the confrontation. Her fate is uncertain. The difference is that Huggy is visibly shown moving after his first wound, while Kissy's scene is framed differently. This does not prove that Huggy has better survival chances, but it gives us one direct piece of biological activity to work with. And if only one of the two survives, that decision will probably have major consequences. If Huggy lives and Kissy dies, Experiment 1170 may become completely consumed by rage toward the prototype. That version of Huggy would not become friendly. He might actually become more dangerous, but his aggression would finally have a new direction. He could spend Chapter 6 hunting Experiment 1006 followers, disrupting both sides of the conflict. The player might survive encounters only because Huggy is more interested in the creatures connected to the prototype. That would keep him terrifying while still developing his story. If both survive, the situation changes. Kissy may be able to stabilize Huggy. Chapter 5 proves that their relationship can interrupt his attack response. That makes a temporary alliance much easier. Huggy does not need to trust the player. Kissy only needs to stop him from killing us. That may sound like a small difference, but it solves the biggest problem with turning Huggy into an ally. We nearly killed him. There is no believable reason for Experiment 1170 to forget that. Chapter 6 should not erase Chapter 1. But cooperation does not require forgiveness. Huggy and the player can hate each other while fighting the same enemy. If Kissy survives, she gives them a reason to tolerate each other. If Kissy dies, revenge gives Huggy a reason to ignore us temporarily. Either version keeps his history intact. This is why Huggy surviving creates far more narrative possibilities than confirming his death. Now let's consider the prototype's motivation for attacking him in the first place. We know Experiment 1006 had already ordered hunters to pursue 1170. What we do not know is why. That missing reason could be one of Chapter 6's biggest Huggy revelations. Maybe Huggy stopped following the prototype. Maybe he never truly followed him. Maybe the prototype discovered that Kissy could restore part of Huggy's original personality and considered that dangerous. The timing of the final attack supports that last possibility. Experiment 1006 does not strike while Huggy is chasing us. He arrives during the reunion. This could simply be dramatic storytelling, but it could also reflect the prototype's broader behavior. Experiment 1006 maintains control by keeping the other experiments broken, isolated, frightened, or dependent. Catnap's devotion made him useful. Safe Haven, on the other hand, created a community outside the prototype's direct rule. The destruction of that refuge removed an alternative source of loyalty. Huggy reconnecting with Kissy could create another bond that exists outside Experiment 1006's control. If the prototype had been trying to recover 1170, seeing Kissy reach him may have made the situation more urgent. That would explain why he attacks immediately. Again, this is theory, but it fits the evidence better than assuming the prototype randomly arrived at exactly the most emotional moment in Huggy's story. And if Experiment 1006 considers the Huggy-Kissy bond dangerous, the last thing he would want is both characters surviving. That gives Chapter 6 a clear conflict. The prototype wants them separated or controlled. The player may need them together. Now, let's return to the physical wound because there is another factor we have not considered. Where was Huggy stabbed? The prototype's claw penetrates his torso. For a human, this could easily be fatal. But Huggy's anatomy is not human anatomy. The bigger body's experiments do not necessarily have organs positioned or functioning exactly the way ours do. Dewey's body demonstrates how radically different some experiments can become. Mommy's elastic physiology behaves unlike any normal mammal. Catnap's body supports the red smoke system. The prototype himself is almost impossible to understand through ordinary anatomy. So looking at Huggy's chest wound and assuming it destroyed a human equivalent heart is not reliable. Experiment 1170 may have critical organs located differently. His large body may contain redundant biological structures. Playtime Co. could also have engineered him specifically for durability because he was used as security. We simply do not know enough about bigger body's anatomy to call the wound automatically fatal. What we do know is that Huggy is capable of moving afterward. That means the strike did not instantly shut down his nervous system. That matters more than guessing what organ the claw may have hit. The visible evidence tells us the body was still functioning. What happens several minutes later is the missing piece, and Chapter 5 intentionally refuses to give it to us. This is why I think the strongest answer right now is not Huggy is definitely alive. The strongest answer is that his death has not been confirmed. That may sound less dramatic, but it is actually more useful. Once we accept the uncertainty, we can evaluate why the developers left it there. Poppy Playtime has already used Huggy's missing body once. The fandom spent years debating whether Chapter 1 killed him. Eventually, the game answered by bringing him back. Doing the same kind of ambiguity again creates an obvious expectation. Mob Entertainment knows players will question it. They know Huggy is one of the most discussed characters in the franchise. If they wanted the discussion to end, they could have shown Experiment 1006 finish him. Instead, they show movement and then take us away. That feels intentional. Now there is one counter-argument that deserves serious attention. Maybe this is exactly why Huggy is dead. Mob may be using the similarity to Chapter 1 against us. Players expect another fake death because Huggy survived before. So the emotional twist could be that this time he actually does not return. That would give Chapter 5's reunion with Kissy a tragic final meaning. Huggy finally sees her again after years apart. They nearly reconnect. Then the prototype kills them. That interpretation is completely possible, and from a dramatic perspective, it is powerful. But if that is the intention, I still think Chapter 6 needs to confirm it. Until we see the body, a collected part, a direct statement, or some other clear evidence, the case remains open. And the fact that Huggy moves after the attack means the burden of proof is now on the death theory. The scene itself shows that he survived at least the initial impact. Everything after that is unknown. Now we can start looking at the different ways Huggy might have survived. The first theory is the simplest. The prototype stab did not kill him. Experiment 1170's unusual biology and extreme durability allowed him to survive long enough to escape after the tramway scene. This requires no additional technology and fits his previous history. The major difference would be the damage. Huggy should return visibly affected by the wound. I think this is the most straightforward possibility. The second theory is that Kissy saved Huggy. We leave before seeing what happens to either of them completely. If Kissy remained conscious after her own injury, she may have reached Huggy once Experiment 1006 followed the player. Chapter 5 establishes how important Huggy is to her, so abandoning him would not fit what we just witnessed. Maybe she drags him away. Maybe she finds help. Maybe the two disappear into another section of the facility before the prototype returns. This would naturally set up their return together. The third theory is that the prototype took Huggy alive. His hunters were already pursuing 1170, which suggests Experiment 1006 wanted something from him before the final encounter. Once Huggy was injured, capturing him became much easier. If this happened, Chapter 6 could reveal Huggy trapped inside another laboratory, being repaired, modified, or conditioned. This may be the darkest survival theory because it would place Experiment 1170 back inside the kind of system Chapter 5's memories showed us he suffered through before. The fourth theory involves poppy gel or reanimation technology. The chapter deliberately introduces biological restoration in the same story where Huggy receives a potentially fatal wound. The player survives an attack from the prototype through exactly that kind of intervention later. If another character finds Huggy quickly enough, the chapter has already established a mechanism that can restore catastrophic injuries. This would make Huggy's survival depend on help, rather than natural durability. And the fifth theory is that Huggy technically dies after we leave, but does not remain dead. Chapter 5 has expanded the idea of reanimation far enough that those are no longer necessarily the same thing. I think this is less likely than simple survival because resurrecting Huggy immediately after bringing him back would add unnecessary complexity. But it cannot be completely dismissed now that the story has made restoration a major part of the lore. Out of these theories, I think the first and third are the strongest. Huggy is already extraordinarily difficult to kill, so surviving the original stab is believable. At the same time, the fact that Experiment 1006 had been hunting 1170 throughout the chapter makes capture a very strong possibility once Huggy becomes vulnerable. And these two theories can actually happen together. Huggy survives the wound. The prototype later takes him. That would give Chapter 6 the perfect reason to revisit Experiment 1170. We find him alive, but under the prototype's control. The story then becomes about whether Kissy can reach him again. That would directly continue the final scene instead of treating it as a temporary emotional moment. There is another reason I like this possibility. Chapter 5 gives us Huggy's memories immediately before changing his relationship with the prototype. Those memories would become relevant if Experiment 1006 tries to condition him again. The player now knows what was done to Huggy. We could recognize the equipment. We could understand what the prototype is attempting. That allows old lore to become active gameplay rather than remaining background information. And it gives the player a strange new position. In Chapter 1, our goal was escaping Huggy. In Chapter 6, we might have to prevent someone else from turning him back into a weapon. That is a major evolution for both characters. It would also explain why Huggy's story has been stretched across so many chapters. He was never only the first boss. He represents one of the clearest examples of what Playtime Co. did to its experiments. The security system worked because the company turned a living creature into something obedient enough to use. Then control collapsed. Now the prototype may be trying to repeat the same mistake under a different ruler. If Huggy eventually breaks free from both forms of control, his story would finally have a clear conclusion. That does not require him to become good. It only requires him to stop belonging to someone else. And that may be exactly why he has survived so many things already. His story is not finished. Now, let's consider another clue from Chapter 5's official description. Mob Entertainment says that as we travel through the prototype's territory, we will meet tortured denizens who may aid us in defeating him. But we cannot automatically trust them. Huggy fits that description surprisingly well after the ending. He is unquestionably tortured. He is dangerous. Trusting him would be absurd. Yet, if Experiment 1006 has now become his enemy, Huggy could still help the player without becoming friendly. This may be the direction Chapter 6 takes if he survives. Imagine hearing Huggy before seeing him. The player prepares to run because that sound has meant danger since Chapter 1. Then a prototype hunter enters the corridor. Huggy attacks it instead. We escape while the two creatures fight. Nothing is explained. Huggy never looks at us like a friend, but the relationship has changed. That would be enough. And because Experiment 1170 cannot speak normally, the game can keep his true intentions ambiguous. Maybe he deliberately saved us. Maybe he simply wanted the other creature dead. The player never gets complete certainty. That kind of alliance would preserve Huggy's horror while still developing him. It would also give his survival a purpose beyond selling another chapter around the mascot. Now let's return to the physical evidence one last time. The prototype impales Huggy. Huggy falls. Then Huggy raises his head. We leave before witnessing another confirmed strike. That is what the game actually gives us. Everything beyond that is inference. So when someone says Huggy definitely died in Chapter 5, they are going further than the scene itself. When someone says he definitely survived, they are doing the same thing in the opposite direction. The honest conclusion is that Mob Entertainment deliberately placed Experiment 1170 in an unresolved state. But if we combine that unresolved state with his history, the survival theory becomes much stronger. This is a character who has already survived gunfire and pursuit during an earlier escape. He survived the enormous Chapter 1 fall. He continued functioning for years despite visible damage. Chapter 5 confirms that he can still move after the prototype's initial stab. And the story cuts away instead of confirming death. There is a consistent pattern here. Huggy Wuggy does not die easily. That may actually be one of Experiment 1170's defining traits. Playtime Co. wanted an effective security system. They created something capable of surviving far more than they probably intended. That durability may now be the reason Huggy can survive the prototype too. There is also a thematic reason for keeping him alive. Experiment 1006 is supposed to feel like the ultimate monster inside Playtime Co. If the prototype instantly kills Huggy, then Huggy becomes another demonstration of his strength. That works once. But Huggy surviving the attack creates a different problem for the prototype. Now Experiment 1006 has failed to eliminate something he wanted gone, and that survivor knows exactly who attacked him. This turns Huggy into a consequence of the prototype's own violence. That is much more useful going into Chapter 6. The prototype has spent years collecting enemies, followers, bodies, and damaged creatures. Eventually, some of those choices should come back against him. Huggy is perfectly positioned to be one of them, especially because Chapter 5 does something unexpected right before the attack. It gives Huggy something worth protecting again, Kissy. For most of the story, Experiment 1170 behaves like a solitary predator. Then Chapter 5 shows that his connection with Kissy survived everything. That relationship gives him motivation beyond hunting. If the prototype injured Kissy, Huggy now has a reason to pursue him that has nothing to do with orders, conditioning, or the player. That is character development without dialogue. And it only matters if Huggy survives long enough to act on it. This is why I think the reunion is actually one of the strongest pieces of narrative evidence for survival. Not because emotional scenes guarantee characters live, they obviously do not, but because Chapter 5 establishes a new part of Huggy's character immediately before ending his screen time. Usually when a story introduces a new motivation at the end of one chapter, it is preparing that motivation for the next. The alternative is that the reunion exists only to make his death sadder. Possible. But given the lack of confirmation, I think continuation is more likely. Now let's imagine what a Chapter 6 reveal might look like. The player is traveling with whatever remains of the resistance after the prototype takes Poppy. We enter a section of the lower factory damaged during the Chapter 5 ending. Something has been moving through the area. Prototype hunters have been killed. At first, we assume another new experiment is responsible. Then we find blue fur. That would immediately reverse the Chapter 1 clue. Back then, blood and blue fur led us to wonder whether Huggy survived his fall. Now the same kind of evidence could lead us toward a wounded experiment 1170. Eventually, we see him. The wound from the prototype is still visible. His movement is weaker, but he is alive. That reveal would feel earned because Chapter 5 already gave us every piece necessary to support it. And importantly, it would not erase the attack. The injury would become part of his new design. This is how Poppy Playtime should handle survival. Characters should carry what happened to them. Huggy's Chapter 1 fall already changed him. The prototype stab should change him again. Maybe that injury even becomes the reason Huggy cannot fight Experiment 1006 alone. He is strong enough to survive, but no longer strong enough to win. That creates a natural reason for cooperation with the player. We need his strength. He needs access, tools, or protection he cannot provide himself. Neither side likes the arrangement. That is much more interesting than friendship. Now consider the opposite reveal. We enter the prototype's laboratory and find pieces of Huggy integrated into something new. That would confirm his death. It would also answer why the hunters were pursuing him. Experiment 1006 wanted 1170 as material. If Chapter 6 does this, then the Chapter 5 movement becomes Huggy's final moment of consciousness. Rather than evidence of long-term survival, I think this is the strongest alternative to the survival theory. It fits the prototype's behavior. It would be horrifying, and it would give Huggy a definite ending, but right now, the game has not shown it. Until it does, I am not willing to treat Huggy's death as confirmed. There is another possibility between these two outcomes. The prototype may have taken only part of Huggy. Remember, Experiment 1170 already has significant injuries from earlier events. Experiment 1006's body contains pieces associated with other major characters, and the exact timeline of when every piece was collected is not always obvious from a quick look. If the prototype attacks Huggy in Chapter 5 and takes another part without killing the whole experiment, Huggy could continue becoming physically smaller or more damaged every time he encounters Experiment 1006. That would turn his body into a visual record of survival. Each missing piece tells us something he escaped. This would also make the prototype feel more parasitic. He does not need to completely kill a creature to use it. He takes what he needs. Huggy survives anyway. Again, this is speculation, but it fits the grotesque bodybuilding theme surrounding Experiment 1006. Now, let's look at the title question from the perspective of probability rather than certainty. Do we have direct confirmation that Huggy survived Chapter 5? No. Do we have direct confirmation that he died? Also no. The last confirmed state of Experiment 170 is severe injury, followed by visible movement. That gives survival a legitimate foundation. His previous durability makes it more believable. The story's deliberate cutaway protects the possibility, and the unresolved conflict with both the prototype and Kissy gives mob entertainment a reason to bring him back. When those elements are combined, I think the balance leans toward survival. Not guaranteed survival, but more likely than a completely off-screen permanent death. If I had to predict Chapter 6 right now, I would expect Huggy to return. The larger question is what condition he will be in. My first prediction is that his wound will remain visible. My second is that his relationship with Kissy will matter more than his relationship with the player. My third is that Experiment 1006 will become his main target, either because Huggy escaped the tramway or because we eventually free him from the prototype. And that brings us to the most interesting part of all. If Huggy survived, Chapter 5 may have changed him from one of our oldest enemies into one of the prototype's biggest future problems. That would complete an arc that began in Chapter 1. We entered the factory and treated Huggy as the nightmare. Then, each chapter revealed something larger behind him. Mommy showed us that there were more experiments. Catnap revealed how deeply the prototype influenced the factory. Dewey showed what happened to communities trying to survive outside that control. Chapter 5 finally brings Huggy and Experiment 1006 into direct conflict. The original monster and the real puppet master are now enemies. That is not a small detail. It changes where Huggy belongs in the story. And perhaps that is the real reason Mob Entertainment did not show his death. The final chapter may need him, not as the same monster we met in Chapter 1, not as a friendly mascot, but as Experiment 1170, one of the few creatures strong enough, stubborn enough, and apparently difficult enough to kill that even the prototype could fail to remove him cleanly. So here are my theories. The first and most likely possibility is that Huggy survived the stab naturally. His body has already endured extreme injuries, and Chapter 5 deliberately shows movement after the attack. He may have escaped once Experiment 1006 followed the player. The second possibility is that Kissy survived long enough to help him. Their reunion immediately before the attack gives her a powerful reason to stay with Experiment 1170, and the game does not show what happens to either one after we leave. The third possibility is that the prototype captured Huggy while he was injured. The earlier order to hunt 1170 suggests Experiment 1006 wanted him found before the tramway encounter, so the stab may have finally created the opportunity to take him. The fourth possibility is that Huggy's body could be restored through the same reanimation technology Chapter 5 introduces elsewhere. This becomes relevant if his injuries eventually kill him after the scene, rather than immediately. The final possibility is that the attack really was fatal and Mob Entertainment intentionally withheld the confirmation for a later reveal. If that happens, I expect Chapter 6 to show us what the prototype did with Experiment 1170's remains, rather than simply telling us he died off screen. Out of all of these, I think Huggy surviving is currently the stronger interpretation. The most important evidence is not simply that he moves. It is everything surrounding that movement. The prototype has been hunting him. Kissy reaches him emotionally. Experiment 1006 interrupts their reunion. Huggy remains responsive after the initial wound. Then the game removes the player before the confrontation is resolved. That sequence creates unfinished story rather than closure. And Poppy Playtime has already taught us what can happen when Huggy disappears without a confirmed body. The first time, we assumed the fall killed him. We were wrong. Chapter 5 may be asking us to make the same mistake again. So is Huggy Wuggy still alive after the prototype's attack? I think he probably is. That does not mean he escaped without consequences, and it definitely does not mean Chapter 6 will bring back the exact same Huggy we saw at the start of Broken Things. Experiment 1170 could be badly wounded, captured, altered, or barely holding on somewhere in the lower factory. But until the game shows the prototype finishing him, shows us his corpse, or clearly confirms that his remains were used for something else, Huggy's story is not closed. And considering what Chapter 5 does with his memories, his relationship with Kissy, and his separation from the prototype side, I think there is a reason for that. Huggy Wuggy survived Playtime Co. He survived the 1992 escape. He survived the fall in Chapter 1. Now he may have survived the prototype. And if he did, Experiment 1006 may have just created one of the most dangerous enemies he could possibly have going into Chapter 6. What do you think? Do you believe Huggy survived the prototype's attack? Or do you think his final movement was only the last moment before his death? Write your theory in the comments below. Leave a like if you want more Poppy Playtime theories, and click the next video on the screen for another deep breakdown.